and I belong to the art team, which is the awareness raising team of ACRATH. So before we commence, we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather. For me, that's the Wongal people of the Eora Nation. You might like to think of the mob that you represent on your land. We recognise their continued connection to the land and the waters of this beautiful place and acknowledge that they never really seceded sovereignty. And we respect any First Nations people here today. So today's conversation is entitled Human Trafficking, Putting the Person at the Heart of Campaigning. It's our second one for 2022. And I suppose campaigning is not the most favourite word to mention these days, but we're confident, perhaps unlike the current campaigning that you're bombarded with, you'll learn much today. So we have two guests and we'd like to welcome them. First to Cath Hoban, who has led Care Australia fundraising and marketing efforts since joining in 2019. And over her career spanning 25 years, she's created multiple inspiring and award-winning campaigns and raised hundreds of millions of dollars for non-profit organisations like cancer research, environmental protection and human rights. Cath was previously the Director of Fundraising and Marketing at the Asylum Seekers Resource Centre, and she was National Director of Membership and Fundraising at the Wilderness Society and the Joint Chief Executive Officer at the Wilderness Society. She's been involved with ACRATH, offering pro bono advice and expertise during campaigns and fundraising efforts. So Christine Carolan probably needs no introduction to most of you. As CEO, she's the person always at the centre of ACRATH's work. She demonstrates leadership on matters large and small and always with the person at the centre. And the campaign that she will be detailing today is the case of the 22 seasonal workers from Vanuatu who were shockingly exploited by their approved employer. We will hear of ACRATH's commitment to justice, leading to the work for making our systems fairer. With an election approaching, we all need to be aware of the many issues of injustice that need to be righted in our country. So we welcome both of you, and I invite Cindy, ACRATH's Community Development Officer, to lead us in today's conversation. Thanks, Cindy.
Thank you, Marg. Christine, Cath, welcome. Thanks a lot. Cath, I suppose let's dive in. What's wrong with the world that we need campaigning? Like, why do we need to change?
Oh my goodness, Cindy, more wrong with the world at the moment than I think we would all agree. I think probably the three biggest things you would have to say is exacerbating with the world, apart from climate change, which I think is all well and truly on our radar, would be at the moment conflict and the inexacerbation of inequality. At the moment we have over 70% of the world's population with less than 3% of the world's wealth. So for us at Care Australia, and I think Care globally, we primarily tackle poverty reduction, but through the lens of gender equality. We think that's the primary driver of change. So how do we tackle a campaign? Yeah, wow. So tackling poverty or even patriarchy in itself is a really huge challenge, and not something you can, I think easily quantify in a simple campaign metrics. But I think what we try to do is really break it down to areas where we have control or influence. And I think that's hugely important. And I see that through the work of ACRATH that you do as well. So for us in Care Australia, we look at what are some of the drivers of inequality, and particularly some of the campaigns we have at the moment is around the universal and generational reversal of all gender equality gains over the last decade. So we're actually going backwards in gender equality, and the impact that that's having on the communities that we work with, particularly in the Asia Pacific region, means that women and children are like 14 times more likely to die or be injured in a disaster and an aftermath. So we kind of break down those areas, I guess, of major concern and identify as an organisation where can we possibly have some control either through direct influence of perhaps political relations, or where we can actually influence the debate, perhaps in public awareness, or in fact supporting locally led communities in the Pacific region and women's run organisations, in fact.
Cath, amazing. Like in one start, it could be like, oh my God, how do we do it? But your energy, and it'll be good to be part of a conversation with you, because you sound hopeful and you sound as if there are possibilities for change, even though in the last 10 years, I didn't realise that it got worse.
Yeah, and COVID's completely exacerbated, I think, as you would well imagine, not only access to vaccines, but the burden of lockdowns and the burden of COVID has been most felt by women, particularly in developing and undeveloped countries.
Thank you. Thanks, Cath. Christine, ACRATH's known for its campaigning and really targeted campaigning. As Marg suggested, you might talk us through the campaign around the 22 Vanuatu men. Now, we know a little bit about this. We know the ups and downs. But can you take us through how and why, I suppose, of the campaign for 22 seasonal workers?
Yeah, sure, Cindy. And I think it's a good campaign to focus on when we're talking about putting the person at the heart of a campaign, because of course the 22 men, and just backstory, they were really badly exploited into the realm of forced labour in 2014 on Queensland farms. And one of our ACRATH volunteers, Franciscan Sister Janine Bliss, met some of the men and called on the ACRATH leadership to really to do something, to build a campaign. And so, of course, we started by asking the men, were they willing to work with us? And I think they were a bit bewildered and thought, who are you? But we decided, let's see what we can do. And of course, we said at the outset, we want to stand beside you for the long haul, but we can't promise anything. And I must say, at various times through the campaign, it was tough, and it did look pretty bleak. But I think some of the elements there are standing beside people, but it's also being really clear, what do we want? And we wanted to get the stolen wages and the stolen airfares back for those men, to get financial redress for them. And so we asked ourselves, okay, who can give us what we want? And after quite a bit of consultation, we found that it was the finance minister, the federal government finance minister, who could give us what we wanted. And there were 4 finance ministers in the course of the campaign, but we knew all 4 and we had abilities with all 4. So we said, what do we want? Who can give us what we want? And then the third question is, what leverage can we use to persuade the finance minister to give us what we want? And we have a mighty volunteer force, some of whom are here today. And so when we said we want letters to the finance minister got an avalanche of letters because our membership are great and engaged like that. We also had, over the many years of our advocacy work, we built up relationships. And when we went to do the acknowledgements of the success of this campaign to the people who'd used their leverage with the minister, there were 38 people that we needed to acknowledge, and they were ministers in the federal government and shadow ministers and departmental officers, but 38 of them who all did their bit in a mighty jigsaw of people doing the campaign. So and we also enlisted, we are pro bono clients of a very fancy large law firm called Allen's, and we asked them if they would pick up this campaign and provide the legal support, and they produced thousands of pages of legal work.
When I first arrived at ACRATH, I think the first day, and I think I was introduced to it by Marguerite, about these 22 men and from Vanuatu, and it was like, I don't really know much about, that incident, but the approach, like you've mentioned Janine, and then Peter knowing every person's name and following it up. I love how, I suppose this is not gloating because I'm part of ACRATH, but the idea that you walk alongside the people. Tell me a little bit more about that, like walking alongside.
Yeah. And you're absolutely right to acknowledge Janine Bliss, the Franciscan sister, and the leader of the Columbans, Peter O'Neill, because they both met with some of the men in Queensland, central Queensland, a long way north from Melbourne, and they listened to what had happened, and it was shocking. And a federal circuit court judge in Brisbane named the exploitation as egregious, which seemed pretty strong language for a federal circuit court judge. So it was about listening to the men and what they wanted, and then working out what we could do, as I said before, who can give us what we want. But also it was about saying the 22 men were so shocked, and they were told by the labour hire company that exploited them, don't try and cause a fuss in Australia. Australian police, and they're not going to be interested in you. You're a Pacific Island worker. Why would anybody want to pay attention to your needs? And so I think this campaign has actually addressed that a bit. And I think we've been able to take it from the actual 22 men that we're talking about to extrapolate to making sure that it doesn't happen again, and that if there were a situation where it did happen again, that it would actually be named what it was: forced labour, a form of modern slavery.
Thank you. Yeah. So, Cath, when I think you've introduced it already, Cath's CARE's focus is women and girls, is at the heart of your work. And can you share a little bit about your campaign around her circle? Like it says on your website that when a woman escapes poverty, she brings along 4 others in her circle with her. So escaping poverty is one person, but there's 4 others. Tell us about that campaign, and particularly about the women and children, but also how it then becomes part of our daily practice. Like back in Australia, me, a middle class white person sitting around, then being impacted about this, like the circle has done something to me, I guess.
Yeah, thanks, Cindy. And I think just following up on what Christine said, I think your words, Christine, were perfect. Finding, narrowing down in a campaign problem and solution what you want and who it can give it to you is extremely important. I think the other really important lens to put over that is all decisions are made through a lens of risk or opportunity. So, it's identifying where the risks are. It might be a financial risk for a company, a reputational risk. In the terms of politicians, it might be an electoral risk. And then on the other side, there are opportunities. And I think in terms of your anti-slavery chocolate campaign, you're definitely working across those 2 realms of reputation risk to some companies, but also potentially the opportunity for smaller companies to gain share value or customer value. So always look at that risk and opportunity lens. And I think the other thing that Christine touched on was the values framing, which I think is a nice introduction to the question that you asked. So we sometimes look at an issue from the one values frame of our own organisation or what we think is obvious. And I think when Christine talks about listening to people, it's critical that you listen to people. And I think there's lots of great examples of very successful campaigns in the public domain that have kind of moved out of the traditional framing. There's one, for example, of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation that you would normally think is quite a fairly narrow conservation approach. And definitely there are lots of people who have very strong conservation values. But what they actually found was talking to people in the framing of animal lovers, brought in a whole new audience to them, people that loved turtles, or talking to people, specifically grandparents, about the legacy of the earth that they would want to leave their children, versus that, that strict conservation lens. And the same with, people who enjoy the ocean. Everyone enjoys the ocean. So I think it's really important when you're doing that campaign planning exercise to actually say, well, yes, we have an issue. Who can give us what we want? Where is the risk and influence? But also, where are the different framings that we can bring people into an issue where they are at, rather than trying to convince them to the way that you see an issue. So, excuse me, we have, I talked about the gender equality as being primary for us. We have a survival gap campaign, which is looking at why women and children die and are more injured in disasters. But one of the things that we sat down and looked at is that the issue of women and children in disasters and gender equality, for Australian audience, there was an opportunity for us to tackle that from the universality lens, the gender equality, pay gap, gender-based violence. These issues have become incredibly prominent. They probably should have been prominent for decades, but in the last couple of years, there's been a monumental shift and a conversation about these issues. So we wanted to tackle survival gap and create a campaign that brought women and younger women in on issues that were important to them, and really identifying a positive framing, because tackling an issue in the public on gender-based violence or gender equality can be quite hard to bring people in. But the universality themes of, we understand what women are in the community, they're connectors, they're builders, when they have money and fortune, they will put their children through education. And so it's that multiplier effect of the strength that women have together in a community. So we basically launched a very public campaign called Her Circle, which encouraged younger women to think about the women in their circle and how they have supported each other, and in fact, how that can build momentum towards gender equality and uplifting communities.
Thank you, Cath. I think of that, and I think of my daughter. She's early 20s, and she brought home the Her Circle campaign. So I mean, it sort of is attracting, and they were able to, then her friends and her were able to talk about different things, that how they were in that circle and what they were gaining from it. Yeah. So yeah, being connected to a campaign from a personal point of view, in your heart and your head, the mixture, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Christine,
can I just dive in before you do?
Of course.
I think that what Cath said is a great challenge to us, isn't it? Because that building that demographic amongst young women is a big challenge for us. And I think whenever we're called on to speak in public, so often people are animated by the call to action. So I've been writing notes.
I don't know whether everyone would say things are a beaut challenge, but I suppose that's why you lead ACRATH, because you're into beaut challenges. So our purpose at ACRATH is to eliminate modern slavery and human trafficking and the harm they cause in Australia, the Asia Pacific, and globally. That's a beaut challenge. Can you tell us a little bit about the campaigning space for systemic change? That ACRATH is very passionate and has a lot of experience in it. How do you go about planning and campaigning?
Thanks, Cindy. And I think the example of the 22 men is a good one for just saying, okay, so we were able at the end of last year to celebrate the fact that the men got financial redress for their stolen wages and stolen airfares. But we also want to just stop there and say that's it, because we want to make sure that no next 22 men or women or whoever experience that egregious exploitation. So we're part of 2 national roundtables, Peter O'Neill's on one, I'm on another, and we raised it again and again, the example of the men, because it's a story and about real people. But it also says what went wrong what's the situation for a labour hire company to be able to do that to people, and for people to be too frightened to report themselves? So, so that's an example of where we're trying to tackle the systems that underpin an exploitative situation. And we've been involved in system change, like in legislation with the forced marriage law, the Modern Slavery Act, and never on our own, of course, but we link arms with people so that we can actually do stuff together. We got involved in a regulatory change at the naming of a visa, because some traffic women said to us, when I take my passport to a real estate agent or to somewhere where I'm going to be employed, and it says criminal justice stay visa, the person says, well, what did you do wrong? And I don't think the room's available anymore, or the house is available anymore, or the job's on offer. So we brought that up, and we together with other groups, we advocated successfully, campaigned successfully for it's now called a referred stay visa. So, and that took a long time. And that's another thing that we've got to be ready for, is to be in there for the long haul. And as Cath said, we're also involved in chocolate and fashion and modern rubber gloves.
Thank you. Thanks, Christine. Cath, is the campaigning space changing? Like, even as Marg alluded at the beginning, we're in the middle of a federal election campaign. So, and we often, it's not just the front page of our paper that we get delivered anymore, it's other areas. So is it changing, and any advice to ACRATH? Like, we're trying to step into the next bit, I guess.
I mean, the campaigning space is definitely changing, and I think for a number of reasons. It's very hard to get to people these days. I mean, you would all know that we've moved from a subscription media, so a publication or broadcast media base into a subscription media base. And so it's becoming enormously challenging to actually access people. You know, digital is unfortunately the absolute way to go these days. But even within the digital market, it is quite difficult to tap into people. People scroll through their phones. You've got 5 seconds to grab their attention. So the importance of really simplistic messaging, and again, tapping into that values frame or that lens in the first sentence in terms of any kind of digital communication you do is really important. I think the other sort of shameful aspect or negative aspect of the way campaigns are changing, and you know, there was a great article by Stan Grant in the weekend ABC feed, was around the othering that we get. And I think when you launch into a campaign, there's almost a tendency to, if we're really putting an issue or a value in the primary frame, what's the othering that does that actually turns people off our issue? And I think, you know, as campaigners, we have to be really careful that we're not contributing to that othering. We're not, you know, you are with us or you are against us. And I think it's, you know, it's critically important to actually find in a campaign the things that bring us together, and the things that align us. And I think certainly using those values in social media and other digital platforms is really reinforcing. And, you know, social media is expensive. It's, you know, hard to know where to start, but, you know, it is the largest platform for certain demographics, or it is the largest platform for all of us, but even aging demographics are taking up, you know, they use their phones more than they use their media or broadsheet media. So there's still great opportunity, and I don't think you can really run, certainly not a systematic change campaign, without the use of digital.
Wow, thank you. A couple of things there that I hadn't really thought about, but that concept of othering, frightening, really, and it doesn't help, does it? There's no bridge then if there is another. So how do we avoid it to start with, I guess?
That's right, exactly. Yeah, and you know, Christine touched on alliances, and you know, you build alliances and partners, and you'll never exactly have the same target or the same agenda, but find what, you know, find what is central and find what is common. And, you know, building those partnerships can just be so powerful with a simple campaign and message.
Yeah.
Thanks, Cath. Christine, we've got 5 minutes left, and we've got one or two more questions, but thinking about the next campaign, or what's popping up that people at our conversation today can be tuning into when we think of another campaigning topic, I suppose, or a theme, or what's going on, I suppose?
Yep, I think the need for a federal compensation mechanism is a really important one. If for those 22 men, there should have been a quick fix. You've experienced forced labour. Here's a compensation payment to address some of the loss. So I know that Jennifer Byrne from Anti-Slavery Australia is launching that at the moment, and we've been a little bit involved in online sexual abuse of children, again, extraterritorial online abuse. So where is their access to compensation? So I think that'll be a big one for us. And also, I think labour hire licensing will go on and on for us.
What about what is extraterritorial online?
sorry. Very serious stuff, isn't it? It's child abuse by usually Australian men using online tools. So
yeah, thank you. Gross. Sorry to even bring that up, but it's sort of hoping sad. Everyone knew.
And we've stood beside a young, well, I want to say a young woman, but she's not. She's just a young teenager. Yeah. We've stood beside her for 3 years in a very significant way. And the exploiter is now in jail because, and the federal police said they got that conviction because she felt strong enough to be able to be a witness. What's her next steps?
Yeah. And Cath, I suppose over to you. Is there something in the last minute or two that you'd like to say that I didn't ask a question about? Or we'll take us somewhere else if you like.
I think your question to Christine around systematic change is a really important one. I think, just all the various campaigns that Christine's just touched on in terms of, there is clearly no shortage of things that need to be fixed or issues that need to be addressed. And, I think from my experience in working for environment protection, it sometimes felt like you'd have some success in a campaign and there'd be another one. It was almost like this game of whack-a-mole where, you hit something down and something else pops up. And so I think, as Christine said, it's just really important. We, in environment protection, we kind of, looked at it and said, well, fundamentally, there's actually a problem with the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Act. So rather than treating one particular gas hub here or one particular site here, how do we build a grassroots campaign that values nature and really trying to cause that systematic change? So I think it's can be very exhausting to do this whack-a-mole. But I think actually taking an elevator pitch and really looking at where the greatest levers of change are possible, even if they're slower, and where to focus your energies. That would be all I'd say.
Thank you, Cath. And Christine, anything further to add?
I loved what Cath just said then. And I think every time there's a moment when you actually are successful, to stop and celebrate it, because if you wait for the end of a campaign, the very, very end, it can be too long in the coming. Cindy, I just want to say that it's great to have people together. If anybody's interested in joining ACRATH or getting our newsletter, to email Joseph at office@acrath.org.au. Thank you, Joseph.
Thank you, Christine and Cath. And Marg, over to you. Margot.
Yes, look, thank you, Cath and Christine. That was just fantastic. And your own genuineness came through. And I think that is really very necessary in a successful campaign. The fact that you showed just great empathy with the issues that you were involved with, and that you were walking with others. And certainly you had us to remember that the person is at the centre. And often we get it wrong, don't we? The campaigner is in the centre of attention, and that doesn't get us very far at all. So thank you so much. And I'm sure there's much discussion to follow afterwards. And Cindy, you always do such a great job in keeping the conversation going. Thank you so much for that. And a reminder to those gathered that this chat goes on last Wednesday of every month. At the same time, and our topic next time is on stolen wages, which is a really good follow-up to this one. How common is it? And I think with the election campaign, a different kind of campaign, that the campaign and the talk of the new Pacific visa for the Pacific workers coming in a different way, there's so much that is current. It'll be after the election when we meet again, so it could be interesting. So thanks, everyone. We see you on the 25th of May.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you, everyone.